Even the American Dietetic Association has come out with a statement saying that plant-based, and vegan diets are suitable for all stages of life. And in that, they've even exclusively included during pregnancy and during breastfeeding. The preconceptions, it's probably one of my favorite topics, that DNA within that sperm to be in the best shape possible, because that again is going to really impact how we conceive and then how the outcome of that baby. So it's such a pivotal time to be paying attention to your nutrition, reducing free radical damage to the DNA as well, and to the sperm cells and the egg cells. All of those kind of things are really, really easy to do through diet. And there's a lot we can do there that's going to, increase your chances of actually conceiving, because that isn't that easy anymore either, unfortunately. We're seeing declining fertility rate. Iron is a big one. I know that, we talk about it a lot in plant-based diets. This gets a lot of airtime. But when it comes to pregnancy, our blood volume ends up increasing by about 45%.
Welcome back to the Plant Fueled Podcast with me, your host and vegan nutritionist, Callum Weir. Preconception, pregnancy, postpartum, it can be a whirlwind time for many. It can be stressful, joyful, overwhelming. There's so much information out there. How do we know what's right? How do we know what's wrong? Especially when it comes to doing it all on a plant-based diet. This week's guest is Lisa Patterson, a plant-based clinical nutritionist whose expertise lie in this field of subjects. We dive into preconception nutrition and care, how to create the best and healthiest versions of ourselves to help with the conceivement, not only for women, males need to be looking after themselves too. We dive into pregnancy, how the trimesters affect how we live, our nutrition, and then fast forward to postpartum, where we discuss how to navigate a time that can be hard for so many people. This conversation doesn't stop there. We dive into over-the-counter, no questions asked supplements, and Lisa's backstory, and so much more. Since recording this podcast, Lisa has actually come out as pregnant herself, so a huge congratulations to you both. You're now walking the talk. And if you'd need to listen to an episode on how to navigate pregnancy, you've got it here via yourself. But before we dive into this conversation, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to you, our listeners, for your unwavering support and dedication. Your passion fuels my mission to advocate for a more compassionate world, one episode at a time. So if you enjoyed today's discussion, please consider sharing it with your friends, leaving a review or rating on your preferred platform. Your feedback helps me reach more people and spread the message of compassion far and wide. Let's dive in. Lisa, welcome. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, Callum. Thank you for having me on.
It's no worries at all. It's actually amazing to finally have you here, because I'm so stoked for this conversation, as I think even for me, this is going to be a complete learning curve. Like, I've delved into various subjects before. However, diving into the subject of things like pregnancy for me is so new. And I think for people who are also planning pregnancy as well, because it can be very overwhelming, I feel like it's going to be beneficial. However, before we dive in, who is Lisa Patterson?
Oh, yeah, well, absolutely. So, first of all, I'm so excited to talk about pregnancy and, sort of preconception care from a nutrition point of view as well. But talking about, who I am, I'm a clinical nutritionist, and I've actually been vegan myself for 13 years. So I started out working in plant-based nutrition and specializing in that. Love that, still work, kind of as a generalist in that area, but really found that sort of pregnancy, preconception, postpartum care just ended up being so fascinating. Like, you are just continually learning in that every single day. So I've ended up, specializing more so in that, spending most of my time working with clients in that area, and it's fascinating. I absolutely adore it.
So what prompted the switch to a plant-based diet? You said it's been 13 years, obviously,
Yeah.
vegan or plant-based. So it's very much there's always a switch that happens. There's that kind of moment where you're like, oh, I'm going to stop this now.
Yeah, absolutely. It actually was, and this is kind of a little, and maybe a funny story, but there was a vegan vegetarian cafe that opened up in my hometown, years and years ago. And I just started going there. I'd always kind of knew that, if I was eating meat, that it came from an animal, and I wasn't comfortable with that. I've always been a really big animal lover. So, on and off when I was younger, I would be vegetarian, and then, maybe I'd go traveling and it wouldn't stick. And I just didn't know enough. So when I started going to this vegetarian vegan cafe, the owners were this really beautiful family and they were all vegan. But they were the first vegan people that I'd ever actually met. So I spent so much time kind of going in and eating at this cafe, and they had beautiful food, and they would sit down. Unfortunately, they weren't too busy. They would come and sit down at the table with you and have a chat. And then they started telling me what was happening with dairy and what was happening with eggs. And I'm a pretty skeptical person. So I have to go away and look into that and be like, okay, is that true? Is that what's happening? And I did. I went away and I looked into it, and I was quite horrified by what I found. I'm sure you've been on the same journey. So I decided, you know what, that's it. I don't want to participate in that anymore. Like, I just genuinely, for the animals, really, really adore animals, and just couldn't bring myself, knowing and seeing that footage that I'd seen, to participate anymore. So I actually started going vegan then, and it was just an overnight thing, and it stuck. But then that's actually what led me into nutrition, because then I had no idea what to eat and how to make sure that I was healthy and supporting all my nutritional needs. So then I ended up later on starting to study like my first degree, which was in naturopathy actually, but I ended up moving into nutrition because I wanted to work solely with food. So it started from that little family in the cafe. Thanks to that.
Oh, that's incredible. There is always those people that are kind of like, at the forefront of it at like the wrong time, I guess. Because I know a few people that have, they were vegan, like 25 years ago, for instance. However, eating out then was hard, or if they were to eat out, it would be like a very specialized little cafe somewhere, and it was like their only place, their kind of like only resource of food.
Oh, absolutely. Even 13 years ago, I remember looking for, you'd go and look for substitutes or alternatives in Coles or Woolworths or the grocery store. And I was looking for anything that I could use as yogurt or cheese, and they only had those soy versions that tasted awful. So yes, that was a fun time. It's amazing how far it's come.
Yeah, it's incredible how far. Because like whatever you think of these days, like you can find an alternative to it. There's not many things you don't have an alternative to, especially like here in
Really.
Sydney. Like you have every different cuisine, but like the vegan version of it. So like there's Greek food, there's literally, things that you consider very meat heavy, like Brazilian food and stuff, and it's very much all plant based. It's incredible because from what I can remember me tasting like, which has been so long now, that
Yeah,
it's very similar from the taste that I remember. Um, and especially especially if you go into like the States, like they have things like Just Egg, which are just wild to me that you can now create like a scrambled egg without the tofu, for instance.
absolutely. Oh, honestly, it's so incredible how far that food tech has come. I can't even fathom half of it, but it's amazing. So, and just the fact that, yeah, now we can go out and actually eat all these different cuisines and not feel so restricted. There's really no excuse anymore, right?
Exactly, and especially when you go to a restaurant, it's like, oh, it's not like years ago where you had a side salad at most and maybe some chips, and
Yeah,
now
hot
you
tip.
literally everything.
Oh, absolutely. I remember going out and you could, yeah, get the garden salad, which was tiny, or yeah, some hot chips, and that was pretty much it. So we've come a long way. I'm very relieved.
When you were in education still, did they focus the nutrition in like a plant-based ways at some points? Because I know when I speak to a lot of like dietitians and physicians and other
Mm,
nutritionists, that education, although was very meat orientated and the kind of old school way of thinking, and it hasn't really progressed too much in like the plant-based field until I'd say very very recently, where it's still growing.
yeah.
Was there a point when they did focus on like health of plant-based foods, or this is still a new and upcoming thing?
Do you know what's really interesting? And it depended on the lecturer at university. So some, I'd say, more often than not, there was actually quite a wonderful education around the benefits of eating more plants, not necessarily plant-based, but they would talk about, how necessary like our fruits, vegetables, things are for health and the benefits of that, and maybe reducing meat intake, but they wouldn't necessarily go all the way into talking about plant-based nutrition on its own. You would get some lecturers though that were quite progressive with that, and they were, so up to date with the latest research that was coming out that was really showing that, this is so helpful for so many different chronic conditions particularly, but also just longevity, overall health. So it really did depend on who you actually had teaching you at the time, which is a little bit unfortunate, I think. Even from, some students I still talk to, can kind of be the same thing, at least here anyway, where I'm based. But yeah, it really did depend. It wasn't necessarily a negative viewpoint of plant-based eating, but they still did kind of focus on the meat, the eggs, dairy, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think there's been such a giant shift, I'd say, in the last, I'd say 4 to 5 years as well, where there's more plant-based doctors coming out, there's more vegan doctors, and like especially like the plant-based health professionals in the UK as well, kind of taking the lead on kind of like having that research there, having the studies and putting it to the forefront, which is amazing to see, considering like you go back 10 years ago, like plant-based really wasn't heard of as much as it is now. It's just so much of a growing, I don't want to say movement, concept.
Yeah, yeah.
It's growing significantly, and we are getting the research now. We are getting the science, but yeah, like it's still new science, I guess, as well. Like in comparison to obviously the science that we've had for the last 50 to 60 years.
Absolutely. And I mean, but we're seeing that right with international dietary guidelines. So we're seeing so many different, I think we have Mexico, Canada, for example, there's quite a few more that have come out in the last few years, and they're actually promoting this plant predominant diet for long-term health outcomes, but also for environmental benefits as well. So it's really, really great to see that it's working its way in there. It's even getting into government policy. But yeah, we do have a little way to go in terms of it probably being much more widely accepted, I think, here in Australia when we're talking about like GPs and the medical system itself. But it's progressive. It's getting there.
Yeah, because I think like when you say dietary guidelines for certain countries, I did see Canada's one. I think that was like 2 3 years ago. Implemented more like a plant-focused diet, and obviously Germany as well. Germany at the moment has very much kind of delved into that. You need to be eating at least 80% plants and then reducing meat intake. And Germany, you would consider being a very meat-heavy country. However, it started like progressing more, and like I think that there was a study a few months back, which I think half the population of Germany are now on a very more plant-based, predominantly plant-focused diet as well, which is huge because that's 50% of the whole entire population is mental, and you wouldn't have thought that however many years ago.
No, that's brilliant. I actually haven't heard that 50% of Germany, are more like plant predominant at the moment. That's fantastic.
Yeah, which is incredible to see. But you can see that it's slow. They're taking things a bit more seriously, which is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. We need more of it, but it's going well so far.
So I did an episode a few months back on plant-based babies and children, which was great. There was a lot of information, and that brought up so many questions for the listeners. Which is all well and good about how to develop and cultivate like a healthy child. However, there's a few more steps to that process. You don't just have a child. There's obviously the preconception, there's the conception, there's the pregnancy itself, the trimesters, giving birth, and then obviously the final result, which is the baby. And I think there's a lot to think about when it comes to that journey. And I think for some people, especially when they have become plant-based and there's a lot of information going about on how was the best way to create a healthy pregnancy without consuming animal products. And for me, I didn't realize there were so many stages to pregnancy, and I think as a guy it is overlooked, because we're just kind of like we do our bit and then the rest is down to you guys. And after looking into it a bit, I feel like us guys do have it very easy in comparison. We don't really.
Yes, I would say so.
Yeah. So, so for those interested in getting pregnant or looking into getting pregnant later on in life on a plant-based diet, let's
Yeah,
kind of take it back to, the I'm guessing the preconception. That's the starting point, really.
absolutely. So preconceptions, it's probably one of my favorite topics when it comes to nutrition. Obviously, pregnancy and throughout the pregnancy, we need to pay special attention. But during preconception, that's where it really pays to make sure that your nutrition and your diet and lifestyle overall is, on point, basically. So the reason for that is you can imagine this is for both parties as well. So for males and for females, we actually have the follicle for females starts to, mature around 100 days before you actually can fall pregnant or will fall pregnant with that particular follicle. So we really need to make sure that we're putting that follicle, that person's overall health in their best possible outcome or best possible health for that outcome as well. So for a healthy baby, healthy chance of conception. And it's the same for males as well. So if we're actually talking about sperm health, we regenerate sperm every 60 to 90 days. So we really want that sperm to be so healthy, that DNA within that sperm to be in the best shape possible, because that again is going to really impact how we conceive and then how the outcome of that baby and that pregnancy goes forward as well. So it's such a pivotal time to be paying attention to your nutrition. And there's a lot we can do there that's going to, increase your chances of actually conceiving, because that isn't that easy anymore either, unfortunately. We're seeing declining fertility rates. I'm sure you've probably seen those headlines about even declining male fertility by about 50 to 60% over the last so many decades. And they're even saying now that, we might be looking at male fertility levels are actually considered inadequate to conceive by 2045. So we really need to be paying attention to how we can support both male and female health during the preconception stage. And nutrition is, I think, one of the biggest pillars there.
Yeah, like I was going to mention that, like I'm guessing it goes both ways, because it can't just be down to obviously the female for like to look after her nutrition to do that. Obviously, guys, we have sperm, we know there's different things that affect it. Things like people's, like, if you were to eat junk food constantly, or you were to be like a smoker,
Yeah.
these things are detrimental to obviously the sperm count itself. But so let's say for a female as such, like, and I'm planning that I want a child, I want to conceive, and I want to create the healthiest version of myself to kind of set up this conceivement. So what is the healthiest way? What are the things that I should be looking to kind of like change in my life, whether that be like nutrition, to kind of like cultivate that kind of like very healthy time for pregnancy, or to at least try and conceive?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a few different levels to this. And I think the first place that I would start would really be getting the basics right? So we can have these really complex kind of cases when it comes to fertility, but that's not usually always the case. So I like to start with the basics in clinic, and that would be, addressing any nutrient deficiencies. So we would do maybe some testing initially, and that's not always available to everyone, but in Australia under Medicare, you can get, your iron studies, your B12, your differentials as well. So your full blood count with differentials, all of those things done under Medicare for a health check with your GP, but you can get it done obviously with clinical nutritionists like yourself and I as well. And then really identifying where there might be those nutrient gaps. So a really big one for females tends to be iron. And that actually can have adverse pregnancy outcomes if we're low in iron, but we can also have trouble conceiving as well. So really looking at where those nutrient gaps might be coming in. Omega-3, EPA, and DHA is another big one that we see. Addressing those first and foremost, and allowing ourselves months to do that. So not just kind of going, and this won't always be the case, but I want to conceive next week. Ideally, we've given ourselves 3 months, because we know that follicle is going to take 100 days on average to mature completely. And we want to make sure that we can put ourselves in the best position. So making sure that we have at least 3 months if we can have longer, because, you would know this from clinical practice as well, but it takes quite a while to restore some of those nutrient deficiencies sometimes too. And we want to make sure that we've got plenty of time. We're not feeling rushed, because stress is another big thing that can impact our ability to conceive and our fertility as well. So we'll be looking at that as sort of a first and foremost, but then also doing things like regular exercise, antioxidant rich diets, a really big one in nutrition. So we know that antioxidants are, for both female and male fertility, really, really key. They're going to support the mitochondria, support the, reducing free radical damage to the DNA as well, and to the sperm cells and the egg cells. All of those kind of things are really, really easy to do through diet. So that's quite a nice place to start too. Getting things like, enough sunshine. So vitamin D is important for fertility. They're just really nice places to start. But then we'd also be looking at the big ones, which is, reducing alcohol intake, not smoking, ideally eating, well, in our case, a whole food, plant-based diet where you can. That's kind of making sure that we're eating enough too. So we don't want to be underfueling during that preconception stage.
I think as well, like from my experience of people that I do know as well, that people that aren't looking after their diets or not thinking about it, that they are just getting pregnant very easily. Because I feel like there's a lot of people that seem to manage to just get pregnant, or it's very easy for them. Whereas I know also a lot of people where there's so much thought into it, they have to kind of kind of plan things out, and obviously different ovulation stages and things like that. However, like, how is there such a vast difference as well between some people that are just like, stick it in, I've got a baby, compared to people that actually. So I feel like it could be stressful as well, trying to, obviously you want to be as stress-free as possible, but obviously if it's something that you really want, people stress everything to try and get what they want as well. And it's kind of like, how are we able to help these people that want to go through all these stages, can't get pregnant, but also they're stressing about all these different stages that you need to obviously for the conceivement?
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, because it can be such an emotionally taxing time looking to conceive, particularly if you're on a sort of elongated fertility journey, right? Like, it's not happening when you would like it to. It's going well over that sort of 6 month period, and we're still not really getting answers, maybe. I know a lot of people kind of go through the medical system, and, that's fantastic, and there's so much support there really is. But maybe we need to be looking at a bit more of a holistic, like actually looking at the diet, because sometimes we might not necessarily be doing that during preconception care if we don't have the guidance of someone who's there to help with that. And then it is so taxing. It's just such a volatile time for your emotions as well. Never mind all the hormones that are, going up and down. And if we're taking, assisted reproductive technologies too. So that's a really good point to make. First of all, I think knowing that can be a possibility and really finding ways to support yourself during that time is really, really key. But the thing about it too is that there's so many things that impact fertility, like maybe we have issues like polycystic ovarian syndrome, or we have endometriosis as well. And a lot of the times they might go undiagnosed. So if we don't have that diagnosis and we don't know that condition is actually present, and then we're still trying to conceive without taking it into account, that can really delay that process as well. There could be lots of other things there too, like, it could be the male fertility factor that we just haven't taken into consideration. I do know have quite a few clients, and they've been tested, their ovarian reserve has been tested, their AMH has been tested, and everything's kind of coming back within range. I'm not really sure why they haven't conceived yet, but their partner hasn't been tested. They haven't done a sperm test to see what's going on there as well. So there can be so many different factors, which I think is really why it's important that if if you're planning a pregnancy and you know that you've got the time there, if you can get both partners, if you are partnered during this process, but if you can get both partners to get tested prior to actually trying to conceive, that can really help to make that approach more targeted and be able to actually support fertility as best as possible. Sometimes, unfortunately, it can be, one of those cases where we're just not really sure why, but usually we'll find an answer.
Yeah, I think with that, there's so many variables with it as well. There's not a kind of
That's
like one
it.
size fits all, which obviously that's the kind of that would be the dream. However, that's not the case.
Absolutely.
Which I do understand for people that are very much, this is that dream to have kids and stuff, and then they get then there's all this like information, there's things that aren't happening for them. It can be a very stressful time, and it's very much, I think as well, like while you're going through that stressful time, taking precaution of exactly like your nutritional guidelines, finding out the things that you need to do, and kind of research as much to kind of set yourself up for the healthiest possible conception. However, once you've done those and put those into place, and if those aren't working for you, and then that's kind of one of those ones where like, oh, we may need to look into that a bit more, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. I think, we start with the basics always, and then we can always test. And it's always a great idea too, that if you can get that support from a healthcare professional during that time, if you need it, we have the ability to find more answers. So absolutely, like you said, so many variables. So, we want to get as much answers as we can if we need them.
So obviously, with the body itself, especially the female body, obviously there's definitely certain times in a month where it's easier for someone to get pregnant. Is there times we kind of need to think about when it comes to things like, I'm assuming it's the ovulation cycle to obviously increase the chances of conceiving, and obviously once we created like the healthiest versions of ourselves, if we possibly can. Um, for me, I have no idea, but like obviously this all really depends on the system of the person in obviously in question. But how do we work out the best time for like the ovulation cycle to kind of work out when's the best time to try and conceive?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really interesting as well because it can change a little bit from person to person, but we do see that there can be quite a lot of cycles where we're not actually ovulating. So we might still have a period, we might still have that menstrual bleed, but we didn't actually ovulate. And without knowing that and without tracking, we can do kind of basal body temperature tracking. That's a really nice, easy way for people to kind of figure out if they are ovulating, because we'll usually see a temperature spike after ovulation has occurred, and that will indicate, we're ovulating, we're able to actually conceive. But if we're not really tracking our period and our menstrual cycle like that, then that can be when we start to, experience some confusion around that, whether we actually are ovulating. The other thing as well is that it, we do have like a textbook menstrual cycle, but it isn't for everyone. There's so many great variations within that too. So working with someone that can guide you on figuring out when you might be ovulating can be a really nice place to start. But we just really want to make sure that we're aware, first of all, of our menstrual cycle. A lot of people aren't, believe it or not. So, it's one of those things that start there, we'll figure out, we'll track it. Maybe where we need a little bit of help interpreting that. And there are a lot of wonderful tools now. So like those body basal temperature, arm trackers, thermometers as well, that are really, really great. But not relying on an app, I should say that.
No, I know a few people that have been relying on like an app in an app store. I'm like, I don't think that's the greatest way to kind of go about how your body works. And I feel like that's the same with any part of your life, unless you're like tracking calories, for instance. That's the only way I can be like, yeah, that's an okay way to you use an app for. But using it for your general health, when this is literally an app made by you don't know who. These people
No, that's
around in nutrition or medicine or something like that, or they might not. They could just, it's a money grab.
absolutely. And that's the thing. Look, there are some great apps out there that are actually formulated by like OBGYNs, pediatricians as well, that, can help through those different stages, even including up to when you have the baby and you're breastfeeding and then transitioning to solids. There are actually a range of apps that could be helpful, but we don't want to rely on those because they can't interpret the differences that are happening with your individual body, right? So that's when we might need to look at, more specific and individual ways of interpreting that for you. But there's a lot that we can do in terms of supporting ovulation as well. So, we're looking at things like having sort of a healthy body weight. If we're not, if we don't actually have enough body weight there, if we're underfueling, we're unlikely to ovulate as well. So there are all of those things from a nutrition point of view, like making sure that we're actually eating enough, that we're fueling with the right things like carbohydrates, which we actually do need for that ovulation process, but then particular nutrients too. So you could go into the weeds a bit with this, but you could look at things like zinc and B6, which are quite crucial for that process there too. We do find that, deficiencies in those can actually play up with our menstrual cycle too.
I was actually going to say, like, the micronutrients are the things that I think are overlooked by everyone, because a lot of people don't realize that there's all these micronutrients to take into play. Because obviously we get taught we see on a daily basis as well what you're taught in school, which is obviously protein, carbs, fats, omegas and stuff like that, and maybe like iron and calcium, but nobody really takes into account all these micronutrients that we need as well, such as like your vitamin D, your iodine, things like this.
Absolutely.
And I think obviously checking if you have like a nutrient deficiency is great prior to this. But obviously, if like once you tracked it and you found out that there may be deficiencies, obviously you want to try and get that in some way, shape, or form from food. And I know for me and you both, we have the same thoughts on supplements, which is obviously they can be beneficial to many of us. However, you can go walk into a Coles or a Woolies and there is shelves upon shelves. I actually went into the local Woolies this morning just to check how many shelves of supplements there were. And there was three rows with about 16 shelves on, just full of supplements, which was a wild amount. And obviously we want to get it from food. However, for some people, that's not going to be the way to get it for some nutrients. However, when it comes to you've been told that you need a supplement, and you go into like a shop like Coles or Woolies, and what should we be looking out for really? Because you can really just pick up any supplement, let's say omega-3, and it's great that it says it on there. It says, oh, you're going to get this dose, but most of the time people don't know the doses they need, and what the doses that the supplements are actually giving is not going to be beneficial to what they want or what they're looking to achieve.
And also the form, right? Like, how often do we see those over-the-counter supplements that are a sort of cheaper form of the nutrients? So, in particular, we might look at iron, and they just like a ferrous form that you might get in your particular iron supplement. And it's in a really high dose, and we're not able to actually absorb that much because we know excess iron can have that oxidative effect and raise hepcidin levels. But then we might also be looking at something that just causes gastrointestinal upset and does more harm than good. So if we, looked for a form of iron, maybe like an iron bisglycinate, that's going to be calmer on the digestive system, easier for us to absorb and actually uptake and utilize, and we won't have constipation as a result. But that happens across the board. Like we see that with magnesium supplements as well, omega-3. Unfortunately, there's a lot of supplements out there that are marketed as, a great source of, in particular, vegan omega-3. This is something that I see in my clinic quite often. And it'll just be a really high dose of ALA, which we know we have trouble converting that to DHA and EPA. We can absolutely do it, but it's a bit of a slower process, right? And that causes all kinds of issues too, because then people believe that they're getting their RDI and they're getting enough of that particular nutrient, but they're either not actually absorbing it, or it's just not the right form for them particularly, because we also have that bio-individuality between people where, for example, when it comes to pregnancy and preconception, we'd be talking about folate as an example of that. And we do have that MTHFR gene polymorphism that we know means that we don't produce enough of the enzyme that actually helps us to convert folic acid into folate and actually be able to use it within the body. So then we could be taking a prenatal, an over-the-counter prenatal that has this inactive form of folate within it, or folic acid, I should say. And then we're not even able to use it. It's not really helping us with our preconception care and our pregnancy for the fetus as well. So there's so many different examples of it. And I think you and I have the same bugbear with that, in that they're marketed so well, but unless you really know what you need, they either aren't doing you much good or they can do you some harm.
Yeah, like it's annoying because like I think like supplements are beneficial to people. They need to be. However, you can go into a shop and you're just allowed to pick up anything. There's no questions asked, and then you're kind of like, oh, am I gonna fix this kind of like problem, or like am I gonna, like, let's say someone's like low on B12 and they need to kind of heighten that, for instance. They may buy a supplement that thinks going to help, but if anything, it's not helping the situation. You're just like, you can go back for like a test, like, 3 months later and nothing's changed. And they've been taking these B12 supplements, but these things haven't been, there's not enough in these supplements to actually help alleviate what was going on in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure you see that in your practice as well. It's something that I see all the time, unfortunately. And, then you end up spending so much money, all right? And you think that you've been taking this supplement for so many months that when you go and get your test done, that your levels should be great. And then you can't figure out why. And maybe that's not looked into further. And then we might be missing the fact that it's just not the right form for you, just not the right dose for you. So yeah, it's quite a tricky one. Pops up quite a lot for me actually in clinic.
As well, I think that especially with supplements, for me, I am allowed to, I think to anyone, you're allowed to kind of create a supplement and then go sell it. Like, there is no testing around that. There's no regulation around the market. Like, for instance, let's just say protein powder, for instance. I can get a protein powder today, and let's say, for instance, with a luck, I can go put that in a shop the next day. That's fine. Nobody's going to question that. However, what I write on the back, that's just going to take, people can just take that and be like, oh, this is fine, it's got all this in it, but they don't know if I'm lying about it or not, unless you have like third-party tested supplements. And a lot of these people, or a lot of these companies, aren't third-party testing. They're just selling things and hoping people just kind of help. It helps maybe, but it's wild that there's no regulation around these things anymore. Especially like your protein powders, especially like your omegas and things like that. What people say in the back of a packet may not be true, or it may be in there, but it may not be the right version for a human to kind of like convert into like the vitamin it needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, here in Australia, anything that falls under the food category instead of the listed or registered medicines that we would have, the TGA or our Therapeutic Goods Administration, then really going in and checking those kind of things. And they do go through that rigorous protocol to make sure that they're safe and they're in the right dosage. But that's not the ones that you're going to find in Coles and Woolworths, right? You're only going to find the ones that kind of fall within that bracket where they don't need to be tested as rigorously anyway, particularly when it comes to things like food-based omega-3. So those like flaxseed oils, which are still wonderful. Like, don't get me wrong, you can still use a flaxseed oil, but maybe not if you're trying to rectify a nutrient deficiency without guidance. But yes, particularly protein powders, those kind of things. Such a tricky area.
Yeah, it is a minefield, and I think for people that don't have the knowledge of it, they can just pick up and assume they're getting what they need from this supplement. And I found this, obviously, things like B12, Euromegas, things like that, is people aren't aware of how much they need, what they need, how their bodies are actually going to convert it. And I think it's always great to kind of like consider speaking to like a medical professional first before you pick up on these supplements, so you know exactly what you're meant to be getting, instead of just assuming, because you can go in there and it would be like, oh, this is great for this is great for that. However, it might not be. And as well, people picking up things like, I think we spoke about it the other day, was vitamin C tablets. I'm like, There's things
Yeah,
that you can just consume a bit of food for, which is actually going to be cheaper than the supplement itself, especially when it comes to things like vitamin C. Obviously, other supplements such as like D3 and omegas, they can be a bit harder, but for things like vitamin C, which is very easily defined at very cheap, at a very cheap cost. Or you can buy like an apple, for instance, which is going to be like more than like 100% less of the cost of like some vitamin C supplements.
absolutely. I actually was going to bring that up because I do think sort of having this really easy access to these supplements, right, might mean that we don't pay as much attention to our diet, and then trying to make sure that, we're eating those really wonderful foods that are going to provide us with the vitamin C or provide us with the omega 3s or provide us with zinc, for example, is a big one. I see a lot of zinc tablets out there, but not necessarily the attention being paid to actually, have a meal with some zinc in it. How can I, keep those foods in the pantry or in the fridge? So I do think we can rely on them a little bit too heavily, and then maybe we're going to be lacking in the diet.
Um, as well, for like obviously for the main micronutrients that you would say, obviously we need all our micronutrients and kind of tact, but for like, is there specific ones we need to look out for or be more aware of for like the conception, which I
Yeah.
assume from like some of them would be like your B12, your calcium, and your iron, but obviously the ones a bit more less known, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So this one isn't less known, but it definitely should have the attention paid to it, and that's folate. So we do see that, we have it as a preventative measure now in Australia. They add folic acid, which, if we park that MTHFR gene polymorphism for a moment, that for a lot of the population is a really wonderful fortified, food that we have in breads in Australia as well. So that's something that we need to pay attention to, but particularly making sure that we have enough folate through the areas of preconception and then in the first trimester, particularly of pregnancy, because it is going to reduce the likelihood of the fetus actually forming, neural tube defects, so things like spina bifida. And that's why the Australian government actually brought in that folic acid supplementation of breads and flours in Australia, because we were seeing higher levels of those prior to that. But still making sure that we're paying attention to that, particularly having an activated form, or, if you are supplementing in your prenatals. But otherwise, we'd be looking at leafy greens in particular. So, like, lots of leafy greens during preconception is such a wonderful support for the health of your baby when you do conceive. But we would also be looking at things like vitamin D, which is, depending on where you are, and what season that you're in, is going to change throughout the year. I'm in Queensland, so the levels aren't usually as low here. But you do still see it, believe it or not, because, we're office workers and things like that now, and we sit inside a lot of the day and we don't get out into the sun for that, safe 10 to 15 minutes up here, which we don't need quite as long as maybe you do in the southern states. And you need to hide from it a little bit because it's so brutal up here. But we do want to see high vitamin D levels. They're going to really help with so many of our the production of our hormones, making sure that they're within, the right ratios as well. The other things that we'd be looking at, like you mentioned, are calcium, but even things like iodine, so making sure that the thyroid is functioning nicely, which, we do see higher levels of thyroid issues in women particularly. So that's a particularly important one, making sure that we're getting enough iodine. Also, if we're on a plant-based or a vegan diet, that one can sometimes be a little bit trickier to come across, right? So we do see that fortified in salt and in bread as well in Australia, which is helpful. But making sure that we can, maybe include some sea vegetables if that's something that people like, or opting for the iodized salt can be really helpful there too. But we're even thinking about things like just making sure that we do have enough B12, which we don't always see, regardless of dietary choice. And zinc, and they're the really kind of big ones that I always look at. Choline as well, but if you're eating a varied plant-based diet, you actually usually do get enough of that. There's a lot of misconception around getting enough choline. That's why people focus so much on eggs when they're in that preconception and pregnancy stage. But if you're eating, there's choline in so many plant-based foods. things like whole grains, nuts and seeds. If you're eating, a nice varied diet, it's actually something that we don't need to stress about too much on a whole food diet. So that's kind of a nice little benefit for us there. But yeah, in particular, omega-3, zinc, those kind of things are going to be maybe a little bit trickier if you are on a plant-based diet, just to make sure that you're getting enough of them, right?
So if we take out the female for a second and we focus on the male, what can we do, obviously, to create the best kind of sperm quality to obviously help generate a healthy conception, because obviously we have less work to do. We just really need to kind of shoot, and
well explained, yes.
yeah, I don't want to make it the healthiest sperm possible.
Absolutely. So that's really key to preconception, right? It's 50% of it, which I think is sort of underrated, really, male fertility and how important that is to conception. So doing a nice, again, 3-month at least preconception care phase is going to be really, really key to making sure that that sperm is in the best health possible. So motility, count, volume. But we can do that through a couple of ways. So when we talk about diet, one of the big ones that we would be looking at would be antioxidants for sperm. So there's actually I can't reference one right off the top of my head, but there are loads and loads of brilliant studies that have been done on antioxidant treatment for sperm levels and for sperm motility and morphology as well. And what we do see, particularly if we're sort of getting, into our like mid-30s and beyond, we want to make sure that we're paying even more attention, because we still do see some impact of age. And again, I like to not be ageist and say that, that's going to be a really big factor, but it does impact the quality of sperm a little bit as we get on. So we can counter that, right, by eating a really antioxidant rich diet, particularly. So we would be looking at lots of those beautiful things like berries, green tea. Maybe we're looking at just lots of brightly colored fruits and vegetables, leafy greens. Bumping that up as much as possible. Nuts and seeds as well are going to be helpful there. And that's going to help with reducing any oxidative damage to the sperm itself, particularly as it's generating from that, over that 90-day period. But it's also going to help with actually making sure that the sperm have enough energy to get to where they need to go. Because things like CoQ10 in particular, that's going to be a really wonderful support for ATP within the actual sperm itself. So there's some really fascinating things there in terms of the antioxidant treatment on sperm and, how we can boost that. And that's a really great, cheap place to start too. We don't necessarily always need to take supplements for that, like we were just talking about. We can just increase the amount of antioxidants we're eating in our diet every day. And that's going to have a wonderful impact, particularly the longer we do it for. But we're also looking at things like zinc in particular. So I'm not sure if you see this in your clinic, but I do. And I see quite low zinc levels in a lot of men. So that's something that eating lots of nuts and seeds in particular is going to be really helpful, right? Whole grains, things like that as well. Kind of a double whammy because we're getting the antioxidants from a lot of those foods too. But that's going to be really, really helpful in actually helping to, produce enough testosterone as well. That's the other thing too, is lifestyle is going to be big on that one. So exercising regularly, particularly with weight-bearing exercise. But it could be anything that you enjoy really, but just making sure that we're supporting the testosterone levels so that we're actually helping our partner to conceive.
Yeah, I think that's an important one, is the lifestyle habits as well. Like, we can talk great, it's great talking about nutrition and stuff, but if you've got a lifestyle that doesn't accommodate healthy living, the people can eat healthy, and healthy is very, very subjective depending who you're speaking to.
Yes.
And while, like, let's say the health of the food could be great. Let's say it's like 80% great. Let's do less. Let's say it's 60% great. There's still a high chance you can do stuff. But if you're like living a lifestyle where you're not really sleeping, you're like drinking,
Absolutely.
or not drinking regularly, but drinking once in a while, or kind of like you're smoking or other things like that. Just maybe like recreational kind of like, bits and pieces that you may be doing. You could be affecting everything. Like that's going to go down into that system, and it's going to affect long term. So it's nice to try and get these things kind of sorted as much as possible. So like try get those like 9 hours of sleep. Try eat a healthier diet. Add more plants. If you smoke, at least and try and quit. Like I
Yeah.
know it's harder than quitting is harder than it actually sounds for a lot of people, because it is very addictive substance. But there's other bits and pieces that we need to do to cultivate a healthy lifestyle, because it's great saying like move more, exercise more, but there's also so many other like things that people are doing in their lives that like it's great that they've got the exercise down and the food down, but they may be a social smoker or like a social drinker, which could also be affecting these things just in the short term.
Drinking is a really interesting point as well, because I think drinking is so subjective, right? Particularly here in Australia, we have a binge drinking culture. And because of that, we think going out and having a couple of beers a couple of nights a week isn't really going to affect our health. But in terms of fertility, we can talk about overall health as well, but that's a different subject. But in terms of fertility, it really does impact the quality of your sperm. So that's a really fascinating one. I know a lot of Western countries are like that in particular, but from my knowledge of my Australian clients here, we have no idea how much we actually drink quite often. So you might go out on the weekend and maybe it's just Friday or Saturday night, and you end up having 10 plus drinks and it's only once a week. But that is such a substantial impact on your overall health. And look, you never want to be the one that kills everybody's fun, right? But when we're trying to conceive, we do really need to pay attention to those kind of things. So whether it's vaping, whether it's smoking tobacco, if it's recreational drug use, we're not saying that, you're the worst person in the world for doing that. But when you're in the preconception phase, we just really want to make sure that we've got you in the best health possible so that your sperm is in the best health possible. And we can give you and your partner the best chance of starting a family, and that fetus and that little baby the best chance of healthy outcomes, right? So it's fascinating, because I think drinking is something that pops up, particularly when I talk to quite a few of my clients. And, I don't drink much, maybe only 6-7 drinks a week. But that is quite a lot in this term.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. Once again, drinking's also subjective. What they think may be like a few drinks down the pub, like every week or so, is actually does have a knock on effect. And I know what you mean with the whole binge drinking culture as well. With me being originally from England, it's very much we have such a big drinking culture as well. And as well, we have various other issues, like we don't have much vitamin D either. So we're really we're set up for failure over there. But and also like there's only certain like fruits and vegetables we can grow ourselves as well, which may not give us the nutrition we need comparable to like Australia, where you can get an abundance of various fruits and vegetables without having to import them
Yes.
as well.
Yeah, we are very lucky in Australia.
Yeah, which I think when you do import like fruits and vegetables, they do over time lose their nutrients as well. So I think, especially when it does come to places like England, we're eating something that could have been nutritionally sound at first, but by the time it's actually got to us, it's kind of lost a part of it, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually something that I do talk about with clients quite a lot, especially when we're talking about increasing your antioxidants, because it does happen here in Australia as well. So, because the country is quite big, we might be shipping, say, apples from Tasmania up to Queensland. And by the time they've been, sorted, picked, waxed, sent up, quite often they're usually in cold storage as well. And we might lose quite a few of those nutrients. So berries can be a really great example of that. and even spinach and tomatoes and things. They've done studies on finding out that frozen can actually have, and I'm sure you've read this as well, but can have higher levels of things like our antioxidants, our vitamin C, etc., because they're snap frozen at the time or shortly after picking. So that can actually be a really nice intervention for quite a lot of the fertility clients and the preconception clients, because instead of going out and having to buy, like, for example, berries are quite expensive at the moment because we're not in the right season. So going out and trying to buy these berries, and you're spending a fortune on that, and you might not necessarily be getting the highest level of those antioxidants from that food anyway. We can go and buy frozen foods, and so long as, we're not adding like too many extra sugars and things like that, they're usually really, really wonderful, healthy options with higher nutrient levels as well. So there's lots of ways around it in terms of it doesn't always need to be the most expensive, hard kind of nutrition interventions. We can kind of go get some beautiful dried foods or frozen foods as well and include those, save a bit of money in the process.
So let's fast forward to we've conceived, we're now pregnant. So pregnancy, that's a whole different minefield in itself. But obviously you managed to get past the conception stage, you managed to get pregnant, and then now we have 9 months of carrying around a human, which is probably the toughest part, I would say. But that's from an outlook perspective anyway. So and there's a lot more to think about, because obviously now you're kind of feeding yourself, but also obviously nourishing this baby as well that's growing inside you. And I think the main question that arises is, can we create a healthy pregnancy without obviously eating animal products?
Yeah, and it's a really great question, and we absolutely can. So even the American Dietetic Association has come out with a statement saying that plant-based, and vegan diets are suitable for all stages of life. And in that, they've even exclusively included during pregnancy and during breastfeeding as well. So we do know that from all of the research that's coming out, but even these governing bodies are now starting to come out with statements saying that you can absolutely, not include animal products in your pregnancy and your breastfeeding journeys and still have really wonderful health outcomes. So that's fantastic news. That's really, really great. You absolutely can do it. There's a few things that we may pay additional attention to during that stage. So it differs by trimester, with quite a bit of emphasis placed on the first trimester particularly. So during that first trimester, we really want to make sure that we're getting enough of a few particular nutrients. But when we talk about for fetal development, one of the ones that I really like to talk about is omega-3, EPA, and DHA. So this one, if we're not consuming seafood, and we don't need to consume seafood to get EPA and DHA, right? But we do know our best source of those nutrients specifically are going to be microalgae. But we can obviously get the ALA, which you and I know converts through to EPA and DHA in the body. And so long as we're having, multiple sources of ALA a day as well, which we can do quite easily, and we can talk about that, we'll usually hit the right target there. But it's important, the EPA and the DHA, they're really important for neural, cognitive, and vision development in the fetus. So that in the first 12 weeks in particular, throughout the pregnancy, of course, but in the first 12 weeks in particular, is really, really important to make sure that we're giving baby the best chance of having a healthy brain, a healthy spine, and healthy eyes. So that's something that I always like to pay a lot of attention to with my clients. And, we can do that through things like hemp, through flax seeds, chia seeds, walnuts as well. And they're quite easy additions to a diet. Given, we have to always remember that there can be nausea, quite a bit of nausea and vomiting in trimester 1 as well. So if that's happening, then we might need to maybe look at a microalgae supplement if we're not being able to keep the food down, or we have really strong food aversions, because that is the thing with the first trimester. It's not as simple as just saying, eat this, because we just might not be able to. And everyone's so different. That's where it kind of gets quite interesting during being a nutritionist during the first trimester, because you've really got to work with where that person's at, how ill they might be feeling, and then how can we get that nutrient into you in the right levels? But that's one of the big ones, EPA and DHA. The other one that we're looking at as well is making sure that we are getting enough B12. So that's quite easy to do. Obviously, you know, ideally we've been supplementing prior to falling pregnant, and so that we have those levels nice and high for that first trimester, particularly because obviously we need that for the neural development system, but then neural system development, I should say. But then obviously we want to make sure that that's kind of going through trimesters 2 and 3, and then during, if we choose to breastfeed as well, or if we are able to breastfeed, because not everybody is, we want to make sure that we still have healthy B12 levels for the mother, so that that's coming through in the breast milk for the baby as well. So there are some things that we would pay attention to initially. Iron is a big one. I know that, you know, we talk about it a lot in plant-based diets. It just gets a lot of airtime. But when it comes to pregnancy, our blood volume ends up increasing by about 45%. So you can imagine how many new red blood cells we're making. And that is passing straight through to baby as well. So we really need to make sure that our iron levels are ideally the optimal going into pregnancy, but let's be honest, quite often they're not, regardless of your dietary choice, because if we have a menstrual cycle, or maybe we have impaired digestion, iron levels usually are a little bit lower, right? Like we might see those lower ferritin levels. And it can be a little bit difficult to bump those up depending on what's going on for the person at the time. So we want to make sure that we're really having lots of beautiful things like legumes, nuts, seeds, whole grains throughout our pregnancy as well, particularly that one in trimester 2 and 3, because that's when our blood volume is at its highest. So that's a really, it can be the one that we end up seeing a lot of people, again, regardless of your dietary choice, getting iron infusions during pregnancy just because the needs are so elevated. In terms of the RDI, it bumps up to 27 milligrams a day during pregnancy, right? For someone who would be consuming heme and non-heme, like a mixture of both forms of iron. If we're only having your non-heme iron, we do want to times that by 1.8 or roughly double the amount, just so that we can make sure that we're absorbing enough of that iron. That ends up putting you up to, I think it's like just below 50 milligrams of iron a day. That can be quite difficult to do through diet. So this is where supplementation can sometimes be quite helpful as well during pregnancy. But ideally, if we've done our preconception care, we'll have nice healthy ferritin levels leading into pregnancy, and that can make that journey a lot easier and hopefully avoid an iron infusion. But look, if you need it, that's what that is there for during that time too, just because the levels are so elevated. And the other thing as well, we really need to make sure that we're getting enough protein. So I know that this is a funny one when it comes to plant-based diets, because we're usually so sick of hearing it. And, you know, outside of pregnancy, we're like, we're fine. We're absolutely fine. But this is for everyone, regardless of your dietary choice. It's just that I work with plant-based people, and so do you. And we need to make sure, because, you know, we're forming so many new tissues. And what is the building block of new tissue formation? Protein, right? So we need to make sure that we are just having enough of that. And the bare minimum, if you went off the nutrient reference values for Australia, is 1 gram per kilo of body weight. We want to aim for a bit above that when we're pregnant, just because we want to make sure that we're absorbing enough. We want to make sure that we're actually eating enough, that we're hitting our energy intake as well, because that jumps up again during trimesters 2 and 3. Protein's a nice way to do that. We can stabilize blood sugar as well, keep those energy levels feeling nice when you might not otherwise be feeling super energetic. So, you know, it plays quite a few roles, but you're making a whole new human. You're going to need to have some building blocks there to create some new tissues, right? So, yeah, it's a fascinating time if you think about what the mother is actually doing.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible. Like when I see these people like creating this baby over like 9 months, I'm like, that the human body is absolutely just insane. Like it was, I've seen some friends go from like the thinnest of people to like, you know, this like beautiful pregnant person. I'm like, that is insane that in 9 months you've created another human, and it's just inside you, and it's wild to me still. It's
Oh,
just
me too. And I talk about it every day and it's still wild to me.
like I was going to ask because although it was already covered, like I did assume that obviously every trimester the nutritional values get slightly different. So I assume it's not the same for obviously each kind of like quarter. Is it quarter? No, each third.
Trimester, yeah. Well, people do say there is a fourth trimester, which is, the postpartum period. So technically that's a quarter if you look at it that way.
I did actually have I've got a friend who's pregnant at the moment, and I asked if there was any questions that she may have had, and the person in question is actually very physically active. She does a lot of CrossFit, a lot of runs and stuff like that, and she's very athletic. And she was actually wondering more if she should still be as athletic. Obviously, she's eating a good amount of what she knows anyway. But I think when it comes to obviously exercise and stuff, obviously I don't know if she's meant to be doing as much things like CrossFit and like running and that as she normally would. However, I don't know if that's detrimental to obviously your birth, because obviously you're having to consume a hell of a lot more calories for that in comparison to someone that's not as active.
It's actually a really, really great question. So if we started just from energy requirements, right? We just look at that. So in the first trimester, you don't actually require any additional kilojoules or calories a day. You can eat as you are, just making sure that you hit whatever it is that you need, your estimated energy requirements, whatever they are for you, making sure that you hit those each day. So we just want to make sure that we're eating enough. We don't necessarily need any more during that first trimester. But when we hit trimester 2, we need an additional 1,400 kilojoules a day, which actually not everybody hits. So that can be quite difficult because you have to remember as well, and I'm not sure if your friend is like this, but quite a lot of pregnant people, as the baby grows, the digestive system gets pushed up, right? So you can't eat large meals as frequently. You might need to eat smaller meals more frequently throughout the day, give yourself a little break in between, because otherwise it's quite uncomfortable. There's a lot of constipation in for most people. Luckily for plant-based people, because we eat so much fiber, we're usually a little bit better off. But that is something that's quite interesting. So, making sure that she can actually meet her needs on top, that might be something. But exercise during pregnancy is really, really beneficial to both mother and baby. So just depending on, is she comfortable? Was she exercising like this before she fell pregnant? Those kind of things are what we'd be looking at, because obviously everybody's really, really different, right? Like we don't want to start CrossFit during pregnancy if we've never done it before. that's too much all at once. But if she's been doing CrossFit for a long time, she's been running for a long time, so long as her OBGYN or whoever is looking at like after her assesses her and says that is fine, then usually it's really, really beneficial. We do still want to, regardless of, and this is tricky because it depends on what you were doing prior to falling pregnant, but say you weren't a particularly active person, you were leading like a more sedentary lifestyle, you still want to actually aim for about 115 minutes of moderate intensity exercise. And so that moderate intensity exercise isn't going to be CrossFit for everyone, because, that's quite high intensity. But maybe we're looking at a brisk walk, or maybe we're on a site, like we're on a stationary bike and we're cycling to where we are having difficulties having a conversation, but we're not completely out of breath. Yoga, things like that can be really helpful as well. But in her case, if she's already been on that journey, she's already been quite used to that, and her OBGYN or a doctor or midwife has given her the all clear, so that she's doesn't have a high risk pregnancy, usually it's quite okay. So incredible for her too.
Yeah, it's wild to see the amount she still does while being pregnant. Although she's very early on in the pregnancy, and I assume it will probably change as she gets bigger and the pregnancy goes on. But at the moment, I'm like, that is a huge amount you're doing, and you're still as active or more active now that you've got a child inside you, which is wild because like I see some of these people that literally, you've got the morning sickness a lot of the time, and some people find it very uncomfortable to kind of like just live an everyday life, whereas she's out there doing more than she was prior, I think, or what it
Oh,
looks
amazing. It's very, I think that's, sometimes you go on social media, and particularly for my clients that are pregnant, and they see these people like running and they see them, lifting weights, and they're in their first trimester or anywhere particularly, but in your first trimester, you usually have quite low energy levels too. Again, in your third, that can happen. The second is usually when people feel their best. Again, very different for everyone. So, I don't want to put everybody in the same basket, but it can be so fascinating to see the differences between people, and that there is no right or wrong. So if she feels good and she's been cleared, she'll go through sort of observations and testings later on to see how it depends how early she is in her pregnancy, but whether she's at higher risk of pregnancy complications and things like that. But if there's none of that and she's quite good, she's healthy, she's been all cleared, then yeah, exercise is really, really wonderful. But for the people that are listening that aren't able to exercise because they're feeling nauseous and they have low energy levels, look, that is completely normal as well. And, we need to make sure that people don't feel like they're not doing their best, because pregnancy is a marathon. It is an absolute marathon. You're already doing so much. So it's really just about supporting you where you're at. If you do start to feel a little bit more energetic later, then of course, we can look at maybe doing something like going for a walk. And we don't necessarily need to be hitting, high intensity exercise during pregnancy at all. So I think it can be quite nice just if you are listening and you're someone that's like, I can't even get out of bed. We understand that is completely fine too.
So there's one thing that when I looked up, obviously pregnancy,
Mm.
vitamin A. Vitamin A seems like there's I've seen various different articles being like vitamin A, if you're eating too much of it, it can be detrimental. At the same time, with plant-based vitamin A, it's not so detrimental. And the amount of like obviously to and fro there was on different sites. Where do we sit with vitamin A?
So that's a really interesting one. In my clinic, I do only work with people that are, on a plant-based or a plant-predominant diet. So I only see people that are coming in consuming beta carotene, so your precursor to vitamin A. Absolutely fine on a plant-based. You can't, unless you were eating carrots all day, every day. We're not in any danger for, we don't even really need to worry about it when we're talking about plant-based diets. We're going to be sitting on a moderately diverse diet within quite a nice safe range there. It would be, and you do see this sometimes, people that eat things like liver and offal and those foods that have those higher vitamin A, which strangely are recommended sometimes in pregnancy supplements and things like that. But that's where you might need to be to have a little bit more concern and pay attention to what you're doing there. But for those of us that are, having beautiful things like sweet potatoes and carrots and all of those wonderful beta carotene rich foods, not an issue for us. I mean, everybody, like I always say, not an issue, but everyone's individual, right? So we'd need to do a dietary intake if there was something that we need to be concerned about. But for the general person that's consuming mostly plants, you just want to make sure you're having a moderately diverse diet. That's kind of actually a nice application to most things in diets, to most of our nutrients, apart from those key ones that we just want to pay particular attention to, like EPA, zinc, iron. But really, you just want to make sure that you're getting that really nice, diverse diet and that we're eating different things across the week. That actually is harder than said when you're pregnant, because particularly in that first trimester, there's a lot of food aversions and there's a lot of craving of carbs, particularly. That's what a lot of people tend to notice, that they just really want, and there's nothing wrong with that, but they might only eat toast throughout that whole day. And that's where we can kind of start to see maybe we're not getting enough of some of those nutrients as well, if we're just A, we're nauseous, B, we've got food aversions and we can only eat plain foods. But again, you just got to make it through that first trimester as best you can. And then we can always, we can always support you in other ways, whether that be through prenatal supplementation, which actually is recommended for pregnancy and preconception. And then, whether we're looking at diversifying the diet when you can actually eat again.
Absolutely. So much to think about with that. But obviously everybody is very, very individual. So it's kind of, you just need to kind of take into account everybody's various circumstances and how they're feeling and things like that, which is obviously during pregnancy, you're going to get such a varied response of how people are going to be obviously feeling at that time on that day, because one day they might feel fine, the next day they might feel like utter shit. Like it's not a constant flow, I guess.
No, that's it. And that can be what makes talking about pregnancy and nutrition quite difficult, because we can kind of give out all of these recommendations, and obviously there's ideals, right? Like obviously we have an ideal situation and ideal nutrition, but it's going to vary so much between each individual. And also there's a lot of guilt already tied up in whether that be preconception care, but particularly when it comes to pregnancy, postpartum as well. That's from most of my clients, they actually say postpartum is the most difficult stage. And even when it comes to nutrition, because if you think about it, you're now looking after a brand new human. You might be breastfeeding, you might not, but either way, you're feeding and you're responsible for that. And there's so much going on. You're adjusting to this whole new phase of life, the sleep deprivation. That's when we can see postpartum depletion really come into the picture here. And that's when people can really struggle with nutrient deficiencies, even things like, low mood, which obviously postpartum anxiety, depression, and OCD are a different thing again. And that's something that we need to see a qualified healthcare professional who works in that mental health space for. But we can still see low mood. We can still see things like, just absolutely no energy. And then that can even flow into the breast milk as well, if we are breastfeeding, and impact the child, the little baby too. So that's a really interesting area in that, we talk so much about the nuances of pregnancy nutrition, but it gets even harder when we actually have the baby and then we need to look after things again.
Yeah, I was about to say, obviously, after pregnancy, then we get the postpartum period, which, like, I'm guessing, I don't know how long it lasts, but what from read online, it's like 6 to 8 weeks. But also, I'm guessing that really depends on the person and the person in question. So I think that's just kind of a general that they've kind of like just said. But obviously, this can go on for a long time, and obviously, I know people can develop like postpartum depression and the postpartum blues. But what is postpartum? Like how what is it? Yeah.
Do you know, that's a really interesting topic, because so medically they kind of class it as 6 weeks after giving birth as the postpartum period. I really, like, in my personal view, I would extend that out to as long as that person needs, because we really know that hormonal regulation and even just adjusting to that new stage of life, that can take as long as it takes for that individual, but hormonal regulation can take up to 2 years. So we can really be going through the after effects of giving birth and of being pregnant, which is, like we said before, it's an absolute marathon. And then you give birth at the end of that. And then you have to adjust to your whole new life. And, whether that be for a first time mum who is adjusting from not necessarily having to look after anyone else to then having to be responsible for this beautiful brand new little baby. But you could also be a second, third, fourth time mum, and you're still juggling younger kids as well. So that's a really interesting thing, in that the postpartum period, they do classify it as 6 weeks if you were going just off the medical definition of that. But really, like, I would look at the person that was in front of me and what they're dealing with and how they're feeling. And we know that could really take up to 2 years. So it's fascinating. It's also a time that's filled with lots of emotions. So obviously, we just touched on there being postpartum depression, anxiety, OCD is a new one that we're starting to see. So things like intrusive thoughts as well. That's outside of my scope. So I would always refer on for that because it's not something within a nutritionist scope. But we can absolutely support as much as possible through food, right? And through diet and lifestyle modifications there as well. So it's kind of nice to work in collaboration. But we're also seeing things like, anemia as well that just is persistent during that postpartum phase. And the other thing with that is some people get their menstrual cycle might return within 6 weeks of giving birth. And you also bleed after giving birth for up to 6 weeks. So there is so much nutrients that are lost during that period. We may already have been depleted in the first place, and it kind of just creates a bit of a perfect storm. But the other thing as well is that breastfeeding, if somebody is able to or chooses to breastfeed, requires even more nutrients usually than when we're pregnant. So even more kilojoules, it's so intensive on the body. And often that's when mums might not actually have the chance to eat enough. And really, they need to be fueling like an athlete during that stage. So it's really fascinating. It's probably where people need the most support, I think.
So I'm guessing when it comes to like the postpartum, if you're living a very healthy, conscious lifestyle, but obviously like eating how you are, you just need to kind of up the food intake. So obviously you're still getting those nutrients available, but also as much as possible. So if you are on a whole foods plant-based diet, it's kind of like doubling that.
It can be, yeah. So again, it will depend on the person. I can't really give a blanket statement for how much they might need to eat necessarily, but in terms of nutrients, we really need to be having nutrient-dense food during pregnancy, during the postpartum period. The other thing with that is that that's what's forming our breast milk, right? So regardless of whether you are actually breastfeeding or not, but you're in the postpartum stage, we need to be having really nutrient-dense foods, and we need to be eating quite regularly. But then if we're breastfeeding on top of that, that's so nutritionally taxing on the body that we then need to be fueling quite regularly as well. We also need to be drinking a lot of fluid, as you can imagine, a minimum of 3 liters a day if you're breastfeeding. So you can imagine this is where it gets tricky because you might be feeding on the hour, it differs, it changes for everybody, but how are you supposed to also cook? And how are you supposed to look after a newborn? And how are you supposed to clean up? And so this is where it gets really difficult. If you have a wonderful support system, that's going to be the best way to make sure that we can kind of nourish the mother and the baby. It's not always the way that it happens. So, particularly in our Western countries and the way that we live. The other thing is that pressure of bouncing back, which is absolute rubbish, that can really kind of affect people's nutrition because they might not eat as much as they need because they're concerned with losing the baby weight. And again, I would put that in quotations because that's not something that I love to hear people say, because your body has just created a whole brand new human from scratch, and now you are feeding that human from scratch, and we need to nourish you and help you as much as possible. And that pressure that you hear about bouncing back and things like that, it's ridiculous. And then you've got the hormonal regulation on top of that. You have the biggest hormonal shift in the entirety of a woman's life occurs after giving birth. And that's where a lot of that low mood can stem from. So, we notice within the first 2 weeks after giving birth, we expect that there will be a lot of crying, a lot of tears, a lot of low mood. Also high highs, of course, obviously there's the beautiful side of that as well, but your estrogen and progesterone basically drop to nothing after giving birth, after being, so high for so long, and then they just drop. And then we have all of those things like postpartum sweats. There's a lot going on, it's a very uncomfortable time. If we started to see that low mood extending after the 2 weeks, that's when we really need to see a healthcare professional, a psychiatrist or psychologist. because that's when we might notice that that's actually moving more into postpartum depression. But hormones in itself during that stage, wild, Callum. Be glad you're not a woman just for that.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I think I think this whole conversation, everything that I've literally learned about what a woman has to go through is wild. Because obviously, some like from the onset of like a guy's point of view, is very much you don't really think too much into obviously how much nutrition you have to look into, how much you have to feed, how much you have to kind of like look after yourself, like. Because at the same time, obviously, you're investing in your own health, but as the obviously the future of like the baby's health as well. So there's so much, and then obviously you've got the hormones and everything else, and it's just a minefield. So I feel kind of lucky that it's less work on our end, but also feel bad for everyone that has to go through obviously that many different changes within the body, which to some people is going to be like a mind blowing experience. They're going to love it, and where some people it's going to be a whole different. It's going to be the very opposite.
Oh, absolutely. And like we should say that it is the most beautiful, incredible thing that a human can do. But absolutely, not everybody's going to love that. Some people are going to absolutely thrive and really enjoy their pregnancies, and that's wonderful. But it's also okay if you don't. Nobody said creating a human life was easy by any means, and then feeding that human and looking after that human afterwards. So it's completely understandable if it's just not the favorite stage of life for you. But for a lot of people, it's really beautiful. It's really incredible. It's why I actually, specialize in it, because I think it is so fascinating. Luckily, we pump out a lot of progesterone during the pregnancy stage, which actually keeps us feeling calm. So not for everyone. Obviously, mood swings are normal as well, but that's that calm, image that you have of a pregnant woman. That's thanks to progesterone. So you can see why we have these hormones and why we're actually, obviously it plays an important role in keeping the pregnancy vital as well. But afterwards, you have the oxytocin, and that's that bonding hormone that happens during labor as well. So the body is incredible, and thank goodness that it actually releases some of those hormones for us to make it a little bit easier in some ways.
Absolutely. Like I it blows my mind when I see some of these people that have like 8 to 9 children and they're having one like every year. And I'm just like, how does your body recover? How are you not like feeling the detrimental effects of what your body's just gone through before you started putting another like seven in your body?
Fascinating. Apparently, there is a TV show that someone told me about the other day called 22 and Counting. And a mother has had 22 children. And I believe is still going, I suppose, hence the title of the show. But yeah, fascinating to me that, that you can do that. And apparently her, I believe I was told her labor was 40 minutes by the end of it, because she's just so used to it by now. But yeah, there is that level. That's extreme. Most of us, just a couple of kids, maybe one, maybe we'll see that. Yeah, absolutely. It's an incredibly fascinating area. Not necessarily for everyone to absolutely love, though, and that's okay too.
That's incredible. Yeah, this whole conversation has been such. I feel like there's so much more to think about, because I think like from an onset of people that don't necessarily like aren't pregnant yet or want to get pregnant, or guys looking into it being like, we don't really have to do much work. There is obviously things that we need to do as well to obviously cultivate such a healthy pregnancy for a woman, when it looks into like obviously what we need to do with our sperm and stuff like that. It is a minefield, but like I'm grateful for the conversation, because it's been such an eye-opening experience as well.
Oh, I'm glad. I think if you were to kind of summarize it nicely too, obviously there's always going to be individual variances and things that we want to look at in terms of nutrition for each person, but it's completely okay to have a plant-based pregnancy, and there's so many health benefits to that as well. So I think that there's a lot of confusion out there. I know that I see that daily in clinic. I get a lot of questions about that too through social media and avenues like that, where somebody might be looking to conceive and they're, say, like a flexitarian, or they're maybe vegan, whatever like stage that they're at, but they don't feel comfortable trying to conceive or having a plant-based pregnancy. And I love being able to say, like, no, it's absolutely not correlated with any adverse health outcomes at all, given that we just make sure that we're really looking after our nutrition, but like everybody should during those phases. So it's not just exclusive, preconception care, pregnancy nutrition, postpartum care, they're not exclusive to plant-based diets at all. They're just there to be really, really helpful. And it's incredible to see people having these really wonderful, healthy plant-based pregnancies, and there being less fear and confusion around that now as we start to see the science come out. And it's been there for a few years now, but supporting the fact that you don't actually need animal products to have a healthy pregnancy and have a healthy child.
I was about to say that I think especially in the last few years, you have there's so much science and things going out that being like, oh, you can have a plant-based pregnancy, you can have plant-based kids. They're not going to be malnourished or deficient or anything. They're going to be absolutely fine as long as you're doing all the right things. That you're going to have a wonderful pregnancy. And I think, yeah, it's one of those things where obviously the same with any kind of dietary guidelines that may seem obscure at first, where people are like, oh, well, that's not going to work for this specific, let's say pregnancy, or let's say an athlete, for instance. You're seeing all these kind of myths be debunked slowly and surely, and it's amazing to see that things we have people like you that is we have obviously talking about pregnancy. We have people plant-based juniors that are talking about having raising a child, and there's so many different variations, and it's amazing to see that there's all these myths being slowly but surely debunked, and that the world is now now very much more open to seeing that a plant-based lifestyle can be beneficial for all stages of life, from the very beginning to the very end.
Oh, and that's key. That word beneficial is key. That's the thing. It's not just that it's safe, it's that it's beneficial. You think about it, there's lots of people that are pregnant, or maybe before they fall pregnant, or they have kids, and they're not necessarily eating the best diet, right? They're not necessarily in the best shape of their life. Or maybe we're eating a lot of takeout food, maybe we're eating a lot of processed foods, those kind of things. And that's not to demonize any of those foods or anything like that. But what I do see in a lot of my clients that are already plant-based is that they actually do care about their nutrition. And so they're already inclined to make sure that they're hitting their nutritional needs. Maybe they just need a little bit of extra guidance in that, and that's okay. I think it's really nice to have that guidance during pregnancy and preconception and afterwards as well. But that's the thing. Usually we're kind of already quite inclined to make sure that we're doing the right thing by our bodies and by our baby as well, our future baby. So I think, there's a lot of unnecessary fear out there. People are already doing so much in the right direction, and maybe sometimes it's just a bit of guidance that we need.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and obviously learning so much from you. We do have a closing tradition, or we did have a closing tradition on this podcast, which I did slowly. I got rid of, and then my mum complained that it wasn't there anymore.
Moms.
Back. So yeah, no, she rang me the other day and I was asking why I wasn't asking the question anymore. I was like, fine, we'll bring it back.
Right.
So basically, you've had a long day at work. You're not feeding cooking a huge meal. You want something quick and easy, but something that's still quite nutritious. What are you cooking?
Oh, that is such a good question. All right, it comes down to two different things. One of them would be, and this is just such a boring little, like a Buddha bowl that you would put together, that it would have tons of kimchi in it, because I love anything with a bit of spice. So basically, you could throw whatever veg you had just left over, chop it up. Maybe you don't even necessarily cook it, because end of the long day, I'm probably just going to throw some tomato, avocado, cucumber, whatever in the fridge is in there, with maybe some rice or quinoa, which we usually have kind of bulk cooked anyway. So that's my go-to. And then I would just throw a bunch of fermented food on top, give it a bunch of spice, if it's kimchi. The other thing would just be pasta, with whatever I had to top it with. But I have a big Italian family. So pasta is my comfort food, but it's also so quick and easy to cook. So I would do that, and I'd probably just throw in maybe some greens and some tomato, something like that. Um, but God, I can't go past a big bowl of pasta.
No, I love those. Those are two actually amazing options. Yeah, we seem to get like what we used to get such a wild amount of different answers because obviously there's so many different people we're speaking to, and some people are like very much like just some dark chocolate or just kind of like a mushroom soup or something like that. But yeah, no, there's such a wild variety of answers, and I think that's what she waited for each time. Um,
Oh, I love to eat, so it'd have to be pretty big.
yeah, absolutely. So where can we find you?
Yeah, so the best place is usually either my website, which is just lisavioletnutrition.com, or the same handle for Instagram, so at Lisa Violet Nutrition. They're usually the two places that you'll find me. You can obviously find links to shoot me an email as well. Um, but Instagram's always a really nice one. That way you can have a little browse through, see what I'm about, and contact me on there.
Yeah. And if you're at any of the vegan markets in Queensland, you'll probably find you as well.
That's true. If you're up on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, you will find me there um, every single market, which is, every other month. But also, we're doing a big Brisbane Vegan Expo this year. So it's a really, really big event down in Brisbane, and I'll be there with a stall. But if you're around in September, incredible. It's like a vegan mecca. It's beautiful.
They did one in Melbourne a few months ago, I think, as well. They tried
Ah,
vegan
there's
X.
Yeah, there's two that goes around. There's one that's called the Vegan Market, slightly different, and one that's called the Vegan Expo. Might have been the same one. Incredible. Yeah, honestly, it's such a good time. It's just vendors upon vendors upon vendors of all the different things within the vegan industry that you could ever dream of. And then obviously the best food court you could imagine.
It was I was actually in the Sunshine Coast a few months back when my sister came to visit, and we missed the
Oh
vegan
no.
market one day, which was really annoying.
Yeah, I was gonna say, damn, could have popped by.
Absolutely. No, I ended up going to a Brisbane Twilight vegan market instead, which was really good. Um,
Oh, wonderful.
but yeah, it's nice to see that, especially somewhere like Queensland, that isn't known
Mm.
for being the most hospitable to vegans, especially up very north.
Yeah, I
Um,
was gonna say you have to stay down south for the veganism. Yeah,
yeah, it was when I first flew over here, I had to go do that farm work, and
of course.
I was stuck just outside of Cairns, and there wasn't many options for me.
No, I can imagine. I lived in Townsville for a year and it was much the same. It was, you'd even ask for a soy latte and they'd be like, what? In Townsville itself, it's okay. But yeah, just outside of that,
Yeah,
not
I,
the most vegan friendly.
I think the town I was in was a small town called Innisfail, and
Oh, I know it. Yeah.
yeah, there was literally nothing there. There was obviously you had your Coles and Woolies where I could get my stuff, but apart from that, if like all my friends are going to like a McDonald's, I'd have to go get a burger without the burger but extra pickles instead because there was nothing else for me.
That's when you become really creative and resourceful, though, as a vegan. I feel like when you're traveling and you're in those kind of smaller rural towns and you're just like, what can I make from a pub sides menu?
Literally that, like, yeah, some of the nights out where we had to hide, I was like, I now need to be as creative as possible because I am not getting anything otherwise.
But how much does it make you then appreciate places like Newtown where you've got the vegan mile and you can just go through and pick? You've got all
Oh,
the choices in the world there.
it's amazing. Newtown is absolutely stunning for food. Like, I actually went there last night,
Oh,
and
jealous.
had Gigi's pizza, which was
Oh, so
oh,
jealous. I love GG's.
yeah,
Oh, fantastic.
yeah. Places like Newtown do make everything so worthwhile because you can go out and literally get any kind of cuisine that you need,
Oh,
which is unreal.
I lived there for a little while as well and it was dangerous. Absolutely dangerous. I think I was broke the entire time I lived there, but I was well fed. So